Hello, welcome back to another edition of Hobby News Daily. I'm still Danny Black, but today I'm joined by Clemente Lisi, who is a writer, and I am very glad that he is jumping fence and sharing a little talk. He writes for Sports Collectors Digest, among other things. Welcome. How are you doing today?
Great, and thanks for having me on.
All right, so give the official resume. You do a lot of things. You're a journalist. Give us the rundown.
Yeah, I've been a journalist for about 25 years. I've worked at many newspapers, including the New York Post and the New York Daily News, which I think a lot of people are aware of. I spent some time at ABC News, so I have a rich journalism background. I also spent 7 years teaching journalism at the King's College in New York City. Right now, I'm working for an organization called the Media Project, which trains journalists around the world, and we also have a website. So I'm doing that. And then when I'm not doing all that, I'm doing, a lot of hobby writing, a lot of sports writing, including SCD, as you mentioned. I appear regularly on hobby podcasts like Puck Junk and TTM Cast. And I also write a monthly column for puckjunk.com. So, yeah, it's a lot. And that's mostly hockey. But for SCD, I cover, all the sports. So,
And you're also a pretty good soccer fan, aren't you?
yeah, soccer is my number one sport. That's the sport I love. I grew up watching. My parents are from Italy, so soccer is my thing. And it's funny, my first hobby experience, people always ask that question, right? Like, how'd you get in the hobby? And for me, two things were happening. One was I was buying baseball cards as like a 7 or 8 year old. And then I was also getting panini stickers, like soccer stickers in Italy in the summer when I went there. And I never thought in a million years that those two worlds would somehow collide decades later because now it's like one big global hobby. But back in the 80s, those two worlds didn't know each other. So it's kind of interesting. I think, and obviously the hobby has grown and the internet has helped all that, obviously, but and soccer's become a bigger deal in America. So all those factors. So when I see like slab stickers at a show, it still blows my mind. So
I'm gonna have to have you sit down and talk to my son, who's a soccer fan and a little too eager to buy everything he can find with Holland on it. So
right.
we got to slow down and find the right cards, not every card.
Yeah.
Um, I want to take a step back. How do you personally feel about the Oxford comma?
Oh, I'm anti-Oxford comma. I mean,
Okay, why?
because a lot of news organizations and the ones I always worked for used Associated Press style, and they don't use Oxford commas. So I kind of grew up with that. Academic writing loves the Oxford comma. So it's kind of interesting because I was in academia for a while. Everyone loved the Oxford comma except for the journalism department. We were against the Oxford comma. So, but students of mine were very like that was like the most controversial thing you bring up in class, like the Oxford comma. And some people might not know what we're talking about, so they can Google that. But it's basically when you write a series of things and you use the word and, does the comma come before that final thing, before the and, or that comma is not there? AP style, the comma is not there. Oxford comma is there. And so it's it's a funny question you asked me because I've never felt it's been a big debate. I mean, what do you think about it?
I hate to say this. I'm very pro Oxford comma.
Okay. It's a
Um,
style.
my wife has, like the seven sentences of examples where the Oxford comma changes the meaning of the sentence.
Right.
Um, and I've been happily married for 20 years. So when my wife tells me she's pro Oxford comma, I'm very pro Oxford comma.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
Look, if I ever had to like go out there and like protest for anything grammatical, I'm a big fan of the M dash. So
okay,
anybody who reads my writing will see that there's always an M dash somewhere in there. That's my way of getting that things in my writing. And every writer has that thing where they want to get those commas or phrases or stylistic things in there. And so, yeah, no, I mean, there's no right answer here, but it is a kind of an interesting debate.
okay. Well, let me ask you, who are your favorite teams in sports?
Yeah, so I'm kind of boring in the sense that I grew up in New York City and I'm very pro the New York teams that I grew up loving. And in New York, you're pretty much, if you like one team, you're kind of like a bunch of others. It kind of works out that way. It doesn't always work out that way, but for example, I'm a Yankees, Rangers, Giants, Knicks person, as
Yep.
opposed to a Mets, Islanders, Nets, and Jets person, which
I call them the Eds because it's all the Eds. It's the Mets,
yeah,
Jets.
exactly.
Yeah.
Now there's people I know who are Yankee fans and also like the Islanders, and I kind of always wonder like how did that happen? But I grew up in Manhattan, and if you know New York City, so Manhattan is I would say is mostly Yankee country, even though in the 80s, the Mets, the 86 Mets, the whole city went crazy for the 86 Mets, right? Um, and you went growing up, I actually didn't have a dislike for the Mets. I like the Yankees and the Mets. But then when interleague play emerged later, you had to basically pick a side,
Oh,
and
sure.
so I mean back then it was like, yeah, so if the Mets get the World Series, I mean they're never gonna play the Yankees during the regular season, doesn't matter. But then this rivalry and hatred kind of grew. And so it's a little weirder now. I always think it's very strange that these two fandoms hate each other when for the most part they never even intersected. So but yeah,
And
I
it's like David and Goliath. I mean, the Mets, God love them, but they're the Mets. The Yankees are the Yankees.
yeah, my wife is a Mets fan. She's from Queens, and obviously, if you're
So
from
is my friend John Newman is a big Mets fan.
right, he's a ex-Yankee fan, right? But
Yeah,
so she always says, "Well, it's easy to be a Yankees fan," and it's like you say that, but I was a Yankee fan in the '80s, and it wasn't easy in the '80s. Like
right.
they were pretty bad. They didn't make the playoffs, and the only thing that got me going was that I love Don Mattingly, and that was the only thing. And then he finally was able to make the playoffs in '95 with the wild card. But otherwise, when they introduced it, otherwise he never would have been in the postseason. So
I think people don't realize that he never got a division title.
right, yeah, people
Yeah.
don't realize they assume that because of the Yankees, and that's still my thing. Like Don Mattingly of the Yankees and Mike Richter of the Rangers should be in their respective Hall of Fames, and they're not. Don't get me started.
Mattingly, I agree with you. I remember watching him, and it was him and Boggs were kind of like the two in the American League, the American League East.
Yeah,
Um, and I just remember thinking, Mattingly's swing was so quick and so powerful, and yet he could have won a batting title every year.
right.
Um, if it wasn't for Boggs, probably. But I think he's a Hall of Famer also.
Yeah.
And I'll stay out of hockey because I'll stay in my lane as much as I can. Um, so you talked about writing, and you talked about your certain styles, and you talked about the M dash. Where do you see yourself as a writer stylistically? How would you define your own writing?
It's a good question. No one's really asked me that. Growing up, I really loved to read, and I didn't love to read books. And that was always sort of, and teachers will always say you have to read more books. And then one teacher in the fourth grade said, "Look, you should read anything. If he loves to read, newspapers, read." And I did love to read newspapers as a child, and so I loved to read the sports section. So there were all these sports writers that I kind of really enjoyed, and I tried to imitate those styles. And it's like all these writers of the '80s and '90s, and like a Frank DeFord of SI, who I was like, this is like the total like the holy grail of sports writing.
Yep.
And then once you do it and you get better at it, it's kind of hard to, I don't know that my style is similar to anyone's. Because when you do journalism, you're kind of just want to get facts out there, and you don't really want to have a style. You want to be clear and concise. That's really the style you're aiming for, is to communicate. If the reader has a question about what they're reading and they're confused, then you haven't done your job. And so it doesn't always have to look pretty, but it has to get the message across. Now, over time, you do create a style in that you're looking for like a really fun opening, or maybe like you're at an event, a sporting event or a card show, and you're like, you see something and you're like, oh, I can maybe write about this, describe this scene that I'm in. Right.
Right.
I was recently at Fanatics Fest, and there was plenty to work off of there because there was so much stuff going on. Or even at the National, there's so much stuff going on that you're like, the hard part is once you've been to one of these, like one national, it's like, okay, well, next year's national isn't going to be that much different. So you're looking for
Yeah.
something different, a different angle, a different thing. And so it's less of a style for me and more like, can I give the reader something new? Because the worst thing you can do is say, a reader says, "Oh, I've seen this before. I read this before somewhere else. I'm not interested." And we live in a world of like very low attention span, and so people will just jump to something else, and they
Yeah.
won't read your stuff. So I don't say that my style appears to be like anyone else's, but it's more like the Associated Press style, or the style of any newspaper journalist. That's what I was trained in, newspaper writing. And so to me, it's, can I turn over a story on the same day or the day after? And quickly is better because people want information quickly. And there's so much, the internet is bombarded with news and information, that if you can get yours, you know, not just first, but be, factual and be concise, and be a place where people want to, read your take or read a feature, And that's what I aim for. And I think that I've been doing that for decades now. And people are always very impressed with the speed with which I can turn over a story. And I always tell them, look, I'm also impressed when an artist can paint the painting, or a sculptor can sculpt something, or someone can, like, or a plumber comes to my house and fixes the pipe. Like, I'm impressed by that because that's knowledge that you have. I don't. So
Right.
they're impressed by what I do, but I'm easily impressed by other people. And when you're a journalist, you're looking for stories. And people always ask me, like, you asked me
Sure.
what my favorite teams are, and those are my favorite teams. But if I was covering those teams, I'd be looking for really good stories. I wouldn't really care if they were winning or losing. I like good stories, and that's what I think all writers are really looking for.
I've covered baseball, majors and minors in the Baltimore area, and it's true. At a certain point, you're rooting for people and stories more than you're rooting for scores and the very. I don't really care how many people show up at a card show. It's neat. It's information I have to repeat, but it doesn't really keep me up at night one way or the other. Yet,
Right.
if there's a story about one person attending the show that resonates with you, that stays with you a lot longer.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. All right. So you mentioned Fanatics Fest. Looking at your background here,
Yeah.
uh, what were your thoughts? I mean, let me give you my thoughts. So I don't put you on the spot too much.
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
thought it was a great sporting event. I thought it was a combination of we have in Baltimore like a fan fest that the Orioles put on with all the stuff. So I found it to be a fan fest on steroids, a fanatic sales pitch for all their products and licenses, and it also had a card show. I did not find it to be a card show that they tried to shove everything else in, if that made sense.
It was vice versa. It sounds like the card show was the part that look, my big thing was that people went to the show and it felt like two different shows under one roof,
Yeah,
in the sense that you could spend one half of the whole show on one side and not ever go to the other side, and vice versa. And so what I think that did was it created some confusion in that I spoke to some people at Tops and Fanatics afterwards for my story, and they're quoted in the piece on SCD, so people can look that up. And they basically were like, "Yeah, next time we definitely should have people at the NFL booth and at the MLS corporate area and the MLB area handing out packs," they were not, which was kind of interesting because, like, well, Fanatics Tops, it has the license for those. Yet they were not giving those out. They were giving out other goodies, but they weren't giving out cards. And then in the card part, it was very high-end cards. So if you went to Fanatics Fest with your kid and the kid loved doing the 40-yard dash, let's say, and then it's
yeah,
like, "Dad, let's go check out the cards." And all the cards were $5,000 and up because they were all slabbed and rookie patch autos. I spoke to some people who were like, "Wow, I haven't seen cards in years." I'm like, "Wow, they're really expensive." They needed more dollar boxes. And it's funny because some dealers who were local by Sunday had brought that stuff out, the cheaper stuff.
right.
But on Friday, it looked like you were at the very high-end card show. And I thought that's great for the people that came for the card show. Also, who's paying $60 to go to a card show? Like that, the
Yeah,
entry point was expensive for just that one segment. So I think they need to iron out some kinks to figure out, like, how do we integrate it? Otherwise, it just feels like two different things happening under one roof. The idea is a great concept.
yeah.
Just I think Fanatics is the only one that can pull that off because of the money needed to be able to bring all these leagues under the table under one roof, and they have the license, so it makes sense. But and the other thing that you have to add to that is that all of a sudden, like, you could be in the card show part and Tom Brady walks by. I mean,
Right.
with like 8 security guards, but still,
That
and
happens
that
all
was
the time in my life. What are you talking about?
right. So
Yeah,
that was the weird thing. All of a sudden, like, you could be at the Topps booth and then Travis Scott shows up and 500 people show up at the booth and he's throwing packs of cards at you. And it's like, okay. So at times it felt like Michael Rubin was throwing his own a party for himself and for the fans. But I
yeah,
think people like that concept. And look, people who've been to Comic Con said this is very much like Comic Con, only Comic Con is actually more crowded. I think
yeah,
if this takes off, it might get more and more crowded. I think the best part of it was the panel discussions because they got really close and personal with some of these athletes and some of these groups of athletes, and some of the stories were funny. And I love card shows, but it's just the cards. And you don't get to hear from the athletes. Or if you get an autograph, it's like, "Hey, great to meet you." And the guy goes, "Yeah, great. Thanks for coming out. Yeah, thanks. Thanks." And then you take a selfie with them, or maybe not, and you walk away. And you don't get any interaction with these athletes really, other than a handshake. Some of them were nicer than others. Here, it felt like they were trying to integrate the athletes and the celebrities and the rappers and the actors into the whole thing. And it's a interesting concept. It's not going to replace the national, and that's fine.
I
And
don't
it's
think that you have to compare them. I think
no,
they can be
exactly. They
totally
can both
separate.
they can coexist in the same universe. That's a massive universe of hobby. You know.
Yeah. Um, I did find it funny that the WWE crowd was probably the consistently biggest, loudest one um, that I walked by. Maybe it was just because I've got twin 13-year-old boys and the volume level hits a certain pitch in my ear. But I was a little surprised by that, but I thought that was telling on the crowd also. And to your point of people who are looking at for cards and what price point they're looking for cards, I mean, are a lot of these people leaving the WWE area and going to finish off their 53 top set?
Yeah, we don't know, right? Yeah.
Right. You don't
But I
know.
will say I agree with your observation that the WWE section was by far the biggest, the loudest, and most fun, and they had this whole WWE Monday Night Raw that you can walk out to your own music with the piping and the smoke, and that was cool. And WWE is used to entertainment though, so it makes a total sense that they would do this as opposed to MLB or MLS or these other leagues that are like or the NHL, they're used to sort of it almost felt like they were promoting themselves like, hey, you never heard of hockey? We have some like target practice thing you can do here, which was cool, but there was no hobby component to it, like zero. And so
Yeah.
it felt like anybody's ever been to a fan fest in terms of, like you said in Baltimore, or like someone said to me, oh, the NFL section looks exactly like the one they set up at the Super Bowl every year. So if you've been to the Super Bowl, you've seen that before. Now, most people haven't been to the Super Bowl, so they haven't seen it. So it's new to them. So it'd be interesting to
It's
see
a great comparison.
once they travel around the country and they make these regionalized fan fests, kind of like Comic Con, it'll be interesting to see. But I can see it becoming more of a interactive slash celebrity thing than the cards part. The cards part will always seem like this thing off to the side because cards are exciting, but it's not that exciting. You have to walk around and look at cards and talk to people, except for the times they were doing breaks, and
Right.
that was kind of exciting. They only started doing that later in the weekend. Like Sunday was a big breaking day, and they had celebrities doing breaks, like Peyton Manning, and that was kind of cool to be 2 rows behind the stage and see Peyton Manning, who clearly doesn't collect cards, but he was just fascinated by the whole thing, opening packs of national treasure, whatever, and looking for a Mahomes rookie or whatever,
Right.
So I like the idea of integrating celebrities in it. For too many years, Tops didn't do anything experimental. They did nothing. And so now Michael Rubin is trying something new, and we should I mean, I've been critical in the past, but what's fair is fair. He's trying some new stuff. Let's give him some time. And let's see what happens. But I think, it's good to experiment. And look, if cards and the hobby can grow, it doesn't mean that people like us are going to be left out. It just means that more people come in. And I always had a feeling, being a soccer fan in America was always that feeling. It's like you complain that no one likes it. But then when people start coming in, it's like when you love that indie band and they go big, you're like,
Yeah.
why knew them when nobody knew them? And then now all of a sudden it's like, oh, everyone likes them, so I'm over it. It's like I think for too long, people in the hobby like to feel like they were doing a Dungeons and Dragons type of thing, and then when people start like opening it up more, they're like, "Oh no, who are all these new people coming in?" So you can't have it both ways. So we need to sort of welcome the new people and celebrate the older ones. And I think there's room for a growing hobby. Doesn't mean you're going to get priced out. Like I said, there should be different price points. Dollar box is your thing. Go for that. If you want to spend $1,500 on a card, then you do that. And whatever happens, happens.
I wonder if the cost of the dealer tables for the card dealers um, was way out of whack for what they had to spend to set up in New York City. The Javits Center in New York City is not inexpensive to set up, and if you're not used to working with the unions, to load your inventory and displays and stuff like that, parking, hotels, it can be tricky for people who are used to card shows, regionally or other places. And then I think there's pressure to recoup your money. Um, and I just think that add to some anxiety for some of the dealers that did lay out more money than they're used to.
I think you're right about that. That's why the national has not taken place at the Javits Center because it would be very costly, and I think that's why they brought out their best cards. They were like, if I can sell one or two of these on day one or two, I can make my money back. And then if someone buys $34 worth of cards off of me, that's not going to cut it here. And so, and I want to admit that on Sunday afternoon, some dealers were cutting out early. And
Yeah.
some dealers were there. They were shops. A lot of them were shops in the New York area who never set up anywhere. But I think they set up because they don't want to lose their allocation either. They want to be there to support Fanatics. So
Yep.
Fanatics says one day, hey, kind of like the Godfather, like, hey, you're here to support me. I'm here to support you. It's like you don't want to be a shop to say, oh no, we're not going to set up there. And then Fanatics is like, we're not going to forget that. Now I'm not saying Fanatics is that, is going to hold a grudge, but you got to
Nah.
maybe you have the mutual back scratch, and I get that. So it'll be curious to see, like I said, when they go to Pittsburgh, which is next, Orlando, and then eventually I'm hearing rumors they want to do one like a New York one, like in LA. The New York one could become an annual thing. I don't
Right.
know that the middle of August is a great time, honestly, because the National is like 3 weeks beforehand.
And you had the East Coast National the same weekend.
Right, and it's always been that weekend, and I don't know what happened at the East Coast National, but a lot of dealers, I'm sure, were split in terms of allegiance, but I saw a lot of people at Fanatics Fest who were set up who I don't see at the East Coast National, or I don't see anywhere. They're just shops around the country or on the East Coast that decide to come. So in a lot of ways, it was hobby shops that were setting up, which is not always the case. So it was new people, different people, which was good because I go to a lot of shows and I see a lot of the same inventory, so seeing new stuff was great. But you're right, long term, I heard it was 800 to $1,000 a table. That's a lot of money. Like
Oh
that's a lot,
yeah.
and some people have tables. That's a lot of money. No,
And that's just the tables, much less everything else we talked about. So yeah.
correct. Yeah,
Um, you had just talked about the growth of the hobby, letting people into the hobby, accepting people, and at the same time, we want it to ourselves.
right.
Um, and you can't have it both ways. But when Michael Rubin, and by the way, he did not make everybody wear white at Fanatics Fest, so
No,
I'm glad for that. Uh, when they talk about 10 time in the hobby, it's events like this. I mean, that's what they're talking about. I
right.
think a lot of people thought it was going to be heavy changes in the actual product, and there, but 10 times in the hobby can come from events like this, not just from the cards.
Yeah, the fear was, oh no, they're gonna overproduce and they're gonna put it in every shop, like every gas station in America will have cards,
Right.
and they won't because they won't. I mean, I know drugstores in New York that don't have cards, and so and Michael Rubin's been running this now for 2 or 3 years. So if they really wanted to flood the market, what he can do is he can get celebrities to talk about it, and that helps grow it. It's like a free ad. And then they have lids, they have a lot of different outlets, areas that they can, and they have the internet, and they can make better products. They're going to get basketball now back. They're going to get football in a couple of years. So they're going to be busy, and they're going to be creating some of the products that we loved in the 80s and 90s that they're getting back. And I think you're right. I think 10xing the hobby is a phrase that everyone jumps on as like a negative to say, oh, because they don't know what it means. And I don't think Fanatics knows what it means. I think they're learning what it means. And I think you're right. I think a Fanatics Fest, if it becomes like a 30 city thing every year, that will be that could be one way to just at least 5x the hobby. Like you're halfway there.
Right.
The other half is, making sure that, every lid store has it. That wouldn't be a bad thing, and doesn't mean you're overproducing. I mean, in a lot of ways, companies are overproducing by just creating many, many sets. They're not producing a lot of one set, but they're producing, 30, 40, 50 sets a year, like Upper Deck does with hockey. That's a lot. 30 sets is a lot. It's a ballpark. And everyone loves flagship, and then maybe they love one or two of the other ones, and then they're banking on the breakers opening the other product and keeping things going. So breaking has become a big part of the hobby. People really dislike the hobby. It's the breakers, but you need the breakers because they need product.
Well,
And,
Rubin's talked about the three forms of distribution he wants, and breakers are one third of that. I mean, he definitely wants one third of product going through breakers.
but they have to because some of the singles I buy that are from very high end sets, I can't afford to buy a box of the cup for $1,200 or a box of National Treasures for $2,400 or whatever. But maybe I can buy one card for 500, or
Right.
100, because it's the only way to get those cards into the wild. Otherwise, they don't ever get out there. They'll just be in boxes sitting on shelves for years and years because the price point is very expensive, and you're not going to get kids or even working people like us to drop $1,000 on a box. It's not going to happen, right? So that's the thing. So I don't mind the breakers. Now I don't love to get into breaks, but they're part of the hobby, and I think they're a necessary evil because they get cards out there and they're going to help fanatics grow it because they're going to get people involved and they're going to get cards out there in the world. And I think a lot of times people don't like breakers because there's a lot of yelling and shouting and all these streams. And at the national, you remember in the whatnot section, all those streams going on at once was like a casino, you know?
Clemente, I was on the main stage trying to talk over it.
Right,
It was
exactly.
unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah,
Um, you made an interesting observation um, before about the tables and the cost, um, and the hobby shops being more of the more hobby shops setting up than typical at a card show. And when we talked about allocations earlier, I think there's something real to that. I mean, when we talk about the Fanatics effect, I think the shops are going to be part of this Fanatics vertical supply chain. They're basically going to be the retail distributors for Fanatics. They don't need to go to every drugstore. They
right.
can use the hobby shops, and the hobby shops in return will do Fanatics events. And then when Fanatics leaves town, hopefully some of those kids and families and collectors go to the hobby shops in the area. So from that perspective, I think it might be a positive card show spin on Fanatics Fest.
Yeah, no, it benefits both. And some hobby shop owners said to me, yeah, even if I'm not set up there, the fact that a big show's coming to New York and puts this out there for a whole weekend, that could help because then people are going to say, oh, is there a hobby shop in my neighborhood or in my city? And they're going to look that up and they're going to go to a store that they may not have gone to before. I totally agree. The other thing too of Fanatics Fest, because we're dwelling on that, is it was a made for social media event because there are people I know who were not there or don't know anything about cards or sports, and were telling me, people in my family, they were like, "Oh, are you at this thing?" Because when I told them where I was going, they had no clue, and they were all like, "Oh, we saw that on Instagram, we saw that on Facebook, we saw it on the local news." So that all helps too. So that was a good thing.
Well, I didn't mean to dwell on it, but you had some great observations, and it was good to talk to somebody else who was there in person as opposed to just reacting to the. I think a lot of the hobby social media reacted before Fanatics Fest even started. Um,
Absolutely.
and I think there's a lot of people that have made up their mind on Fanatics one way or the other without seeing, how Fanatics may grow or change. And this is definitely a learning event. But uh, I was glad you talked it through with me. Yeah, some great observations. And I appreciate you coming on. Clearly, you and I could do 3 hours, but I promised you we wouldn't. So can I at least get you to come back in a couple of months and we'll talk some non-Fanatics Fest?
Anytime.
All right, I appreciate it. Clemente Lisi, thank you for being on. To everybody else, see you next time on Hobby News Daily. Take care.